everybody. I'm Sarah Hall, and I am the Executive Director of the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. Thank you for joining us once again for Let's Talk Art. For those of you who might benefit from a Zoom refresher, this is a webinar format, although we do approach these programs as conversations, and Daniel and I will go back and forth, and mostly it's me interrupting him. You can feel free to interrupt either one of us by asking or answering questions in the chat or raising your hand, and we'll get to you as soon as we are able. I'm a big believer that sometimes questions are best answered in the moment. You can also adjust your screen view at top right between gallery or speaker view. Gallery view will show you both of us, and speaker view will just show you the one of us who's speaking, and we'll bounce back and forth a bit. A little bit of museum news before we get into things. We just closed our annual regional juried exhibition, the Cumberland Valley Artists and Cumberland Valley Photographers shows. And right now it's kind of amazing that Daniel is with us because he is working so hard along with the curatorial team on a lot of different projects. We're really excited that we are installing a group of Claire McCardle fashions from our permanent collection. I think it's about 10 different dresses or separates that are going to be going on view in our Schreiber gallery May 9th, and they'll stay up for about 6 months. And we've had a lot of fun getting involved in the story of Claire McCardle and her impact on American fashion through that. We also have Landscapes and Legends, William Singer and his contemporaries in Norway, that's opening soon, and Treasures of State. So a lot of curatorial activity going on. One of the highlights of our program year is coming up May 6th through May 14th. We will have the Washington County Public Schools Elementary School Art Exhibition on view, and May 20th through 28th, we will have the secondary students, middle and high school. A personal commercial: if you are a member of the museum, May 10th, I am hosting Art Social Hour, and we're going to do Gottfried Schalken's self-portrait again, because in March we were having some technical problems, and I chatted about it in a really, really nice conversation with 2 other people. I hope I have a few more people on May 10th at noon. It's a good reason to join the museum. People who like Art Social Hour like it a lot. It's an online conversation where we get in depth about one work of art. Our self-organized exhibition, Landscapes and Legends, which I mentioned before, opens May 27th. We have a really fun community day associated with that on June 10th, which we are calling Viking Day. It may be the only chance you get to try axe throwing anywhere in proximity to the museum. We have a mobile axe throwing truck coming, and we're going to have mead tastings and all sorts of Viking related activity as we celebrate the Norwegian landscape. So that's enough commercials for all the things we're doing to prove to you just how busy we are as we try to keep the museum lively and share our collections in different kinds of ways. Tonight, I am here, as always, with Agnita M. Stine Schreiber, curator Daniel Fulco, and we are going to do a fast and furious survey of recent museum acquisitions. And there's going to be a lot of variety here: Art Nouveau, 20th century ceramics, Japanese prints, German Expressionism. We have so many goodies to share. And maybe we'll even talk a little bit about our process as we assess acquisitions and how we bring things into the collection as we go. So with that said, I'm going to let Daniel do his screen share, and we'll start talking about art.
Thanks, Sarah. Let me just get this shared. There we go. So tonight we're going to be looking at a variety of acquisitions that we have made since last year, and we're going to bring you up to actually just about a week or 2 ago here in April, depending on what we cover tonight. But to begin with, we go back and look at a donor that you probably heard us talk about in previous programs, the John and Sylvia O'Brien, who have been so generous to donate to us, I would say nearly 100 works on paper, mainly by European artists, but also, as you're going to see, by some Americans too. And for John, O'Brien, who used to be a professor at Yale University of American and European History, one of his lifelong passions is collecting, particularly Italian drawings, some French, and also prints. So John really has an extensive collection, and some of which he's been so generous to share with the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. One of those examples tonight is by this artist named Andrea Appiani, who is not really very well known, but in his day, he's perhaps best known as a key figure in creating the visual legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte in Italy. And this drawing is only attributed to Appiani, and what it likely shows is a study for a figure for one of his mural decorations. But if you look at it, the highlights on this figure, it's a man, he's sort of turning his body in this direction. He has a knife, and look, he's dragging this other man with him.
It's pretty terrifying. I'm going to ask you, Daniel. So what do you look at? I mean, when we use terms like attributed to, what are connoisseurs or curators looking at in a drawing when they're making that kind of assessment?
That's a great question. One of the things that I do is I start by looking at known works, in this case, drawings by the artist that have been published or that are available online, that is published in catalogs or books. And I do a comparison to see, does this work have anything artistically, aesthetically to do with the artist that it has the attribution? And one of the things that I will discover sometimes is it does. I think in this case, the drawing we're looking at could very well be by Appiani or perhaps someone in his studio, because he used this kind of technique, this kind of shading and modeling for works like this that you see here.
I think
But
our
also,
drawing is more beautiful.
I agree with you. I think those ones are more.
They're a little bit chunkier and less fluid feeling, right? The figures feel more static, more fixed.
Yes. And it could be, Sarah, and it's interesting you bring this up, that as I do more research, I may learn that this may not be Appiani, but actually was placed on it. This happens a lot by the dealer. And sometimes this would happen as the drawing came to a dealer, they acquired it with a particular artist name attached to it, but that doesn't mean that person did it. So for the moment, I'm saying it could be attributed to him, particularly because of the choice of this brown paper that you see here.
Mm-hmm.
But this is much more detailed. It's zooming in on one particular figure. And notice here that this may have been at a more advanced stage because the drawing is squared off for transfer to the plaster for the mural decoration.
It's really, you know, in spite of the violence of the image, it's kind of moving because our aggressor here, you know, he looks kind of worn out and sinewy and like maybe he's been at battle too long. And, you know, I think there's a lot more sensitivity in this drawing than the other comparison images. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, as you do further research, how we feel. Was there a time when Appiani was like particularly desirable and somebody might have wanted to place his name on something for prestige?
Possibly, yes. And it would have been some time, I think, during Napoleon's reign in the early 1800s there, on the late 18th and the early 19th century. He primarily worked in Milan, and he did a series of decorations for the royal palace there, which at different times Napoleon occupied as in his capacity. So, you know, there is this possibility, though, that it may be an entirely different artist. I will have to see with more research. But it's really an extraordinary drawing. Look at the effort he's exerting. He's pulling that figure, and there's a staircase here as well.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting.
And among a couple of other drawings that came to us late last year is another one. Again, this needs much research, and it's very particular because it's a supposedly Russian, a study for some kind of a ceiling, I think, for one of the imperial residences of the Romanovs, of the Tsar's family. And again, look at the highlights on the different classical gods here. You see the levels of their sort of their rank as you move up through the composition. And then here you have Zeus and Hera here on Olympus. It's a gathering of all the Olympian gods. But look at the way that the light reflects off of Fame here, and then also Apollo down here. This is just really extraordinary, this piece.
It's like a spotlight. Yeah.
Yes. And then there's an inscription down here. I don't have a detail with me, but it's signed and dated 1862. But I have to consult somebody who knows Russian to decipher exactly what it is it says. So this one presents an opportunity again for more investigation. Now, very differently, we have a drawing that was given by an artist named Francis Augustus Lathrop, an American decorative artist who did stained glass designs. He was invited by James McNeill Whistler to study with him in London. And Lathrop then, after he went to London, he became associated with pre-Raphaelite artists such as Ford Madox Brown and Edward Coley Burne-Jones, both of whom were quite famous in the movement. And Lathrop also had a connection to William Morris, the designer, and I think he collaborated with him on some stained glass projects. But the drawing we have, Lathrop brings us into a 19th century artist studio. And he shows us actually, I think if we look here, it would appear to be women actually who are at work here. It looks like there's a woman here, and then there's another man who's making sketches alongside of her.
I was going to ask you, what can we learn about, artist training at the time from this? And it's great having both men and women studying together, probably right when that was first happening a little bit.
Yes, because oftentimes when you see these studio subjects, it's shown as being, primarily in male space, unless it's a designated academy for women. So this really brings up an interesting conversation. Mm-hmm. And then look up here at the way that the light filters in through the windows and then reflects off of the various objects and the people in the studio. It's a lovely piece. Now here we're moving to some prints, and we have one here by Wenceslaus Hollar, who was a Czech artist who worked in England and probably the most important among the most important Czech Baroque printmakers. But this is after the very famous artist Martin Schongauer of the German Renaissance, who famously influenced Albrecht Dürer a great deal, even though the two artists never met one another. But the representation of her is just beautiful in this. She gazes out at us, and then here she holds a wreath of oak, which is a traditional symbol of wisdom. Look at the locks of her hair as well.
Well, the shallow observation of the night will be how much that hair reminds me of Dürer's self-portrait hair.
Yes.
Yeah. But Hollar, one of the very first exhibitions I ever worked on was a show of his prints. And he is known, I think, for capturing views of London before the Great Fire. Like often his prints are used as references for, what used to be in London at a certain period in time. It's like the only record sometimes for architecture or streets or relationships of things.
Exactly. And he also produced numerous topographical works and maps. So he was really an important documentarian of the period. But you can see here how Albrecht Dürer was influenced by Schongauer. It's always interesting to see how artists look at other masters. A lesser known artist, French, named Francois Chauveau, who was a book illustrator, and he had the distinction of being the first printmaker to be elected to the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, which I think was founded in the 1640s, if I'm not mistaken. So this is a classical subject from mythology of Europa and the Bull, which is told in Ovid and also Hesiod, among other ancient authors. And it has that Baroque energy and dynamism here as the bull carries Europa away. And then you have the interaction and reaction of these different figures. It's beautifully incised and printed.
It is. It's one of those, how mythology can make violent and unpleasant scenes seem much more palatable.
Exactly. Gabrielle and Nicolas Perel were artists who worked for. Gabrielle was actually the father, Nicolas his son, as was common at the time. They worked for Louis XIV, and they worked in the tradition of Claude Lorrain, creating these beautiful, expansive landscapes that combine elements derived from Italian scenes of the countryside. But actually, from what I could find out, the Perels, I don't think, went to Italy. So they were absorbing these influences from the Italian Baroque. And you'll note the ruins here that have been overtaken by the vegetation. And look at the recession into space here as well, of these travelers who are making their way through here. And
Lovely, like the definition of a classical landscape almost.
Really, yes. It's beautiful. And it reminds me, Sarah, of back when we had the exhibition from the Reading Public Museum in Pennsylvania of the Dutch Golden Age prints.
So that was the era when everybody had to travel to Italy to spend some time studying. And so often, what's picturesque in terms of placement of ruins and landscape and a poplar tree here and there is real in Italy, but then becomes a part of the vocabulary of landscape for everyone else who's working in that mode from other places. So it's really interesting that artist probably never experienced the Italian landscape. It is truly just Italianate. And
they really are. I mean, even down to the houses here, these don't really look like dwellings that one might see in where he was from in central France, possibly down south in Provence, but it looks much more like the Italian campagna or countryside. And here we move to a kind of printmaking that's very near and dear to Sarah, mezzotints.
I'm near and dear to Sarah. It's funny because I've had maybe more experience with mezzotints than many people because first, where I used to work, we had a really nice mezzotint collection because Henry Clay Frick had bought a number of them. I think it was 1903 or 1904. These 18th century prints were incredibly desirable for collectors. And mezzotint as a medium it really is prized for the fact that although it's black and white, it captures tonality with incredible subtlety. So it's considered to be the printmaking form that best represents painting. And therefore it had this sort of flowering in the 18th century and probably late 17th century as well. And a lot of famous paintings were done as mezzotints so that those paintings could then have a wider audience. But it's an incredibly tricky technique. And I worked with a contemporary artist, Craig McPherson, who's based in Virginia, who's known for doing, I think, the largest documented mezzotint. I worked on an exhibition with him in Pittsburgh also. And the technique is, sort of the opposite of intaglio, where you're going into the plate. In mezzotint, you go over it with a tool called a rocker, and you make the whole plate sort of fuzzy. You kick up a metal burr everywhere, and then you flatten. So you're working actually you're working the light tones instead of the dark tones, I think is the way to say it. You get these incredibly rich velvety blacks, and you get so much more tonal representation than you get in other forms of printmaking. So it's really tedious to do, and not many people do it anymore, but they are beautiful prints.
Yes, and we were fortunate enough to get a selection of these, primarily here of English royals, in this case, Queen Mary II, who was married to William III of England, William of Orange. And these indeed are really very detailed prints. Look at the amazing light, the way that Gerard Falk, this Dutch-born artist, look at how he captured the light as it falls and reflects off William's wig. It's really beautifully done.
Well, every curl, and also I love the bridge of his nose, his very, quirky nose that's full of individuality and wonderful light on it.
And then in this one, the attention to detail by Nicolas Fischer II of Queen Mary's dress, which is really elaborate.
That's astonishing. No matter what means of reproduction you're using, that's just astonishing. Wow, look at, not only just the complexities of the lace, but I'm looking at how her arm is emerging from the sleeve and all of those cascades and the shadows, and also her incredibly strangely attenuated fingers. They're wonderful. She's like a creature.
Yeah, it really is. And then even it makes its way onto the drape that surrounds her and aggrandizes her as well. Another printmaker, Peter Pelham, who actually emigrated to America and established a printmaking business and mezzotint making specifically in Boston in colonial America. This being done, he did after Sir Godfrey Kneller, who was one of the most famous and important British portraitists of the royals after Sir Peter Leland. So he did works of a number of monarchs ranging from Charles II all the way up through George the First. So he had a very long career. And again, the capturing the light and the textures. Look at that on his ermine here.
And the fact that you could say it's ermine, that just shows how well it's capturing the texture.
Now, related to what we were talking about there with England, but very different and coming up much later into the period of neoclassicism in the 18th century, is an artist named Alexander Runciman, who was a Scottish neoclassical printmaker. And these are really beautiful etchings. They're so immediate, and they depict several medieval episodes in history of the arrival of St. Margaret in Scotland, which was back in the 1000s, and then the marriage of St. Margaret and King Malcolm III of Scotland. What's interesting is Runciman did these after his brother's works. The two of them, his brother was a painter, but Runciman, Alexander, was really focused on print specifically. And he traveled abroad to Italy, but then came back and basically worked his whole career in Edinburgh. And the way that he depicts the wind blowing in Margaret's
you really can feel like you're at the docks there, getting off the boat, and it's not the best day to be at sea.
No, it's not. And then also the interaction and reactions of the figures, as well as this woman looks back towards something that's going on the boat. And then the marriage too, there's a quickness of execution in the also the way that these lines are incised that's really quite remarkable. And he continues that in a work that's done after James Macpherson, the Scottish poet's poem called Fingal, based on a very old, legendary Irish bard, Ossian. And this is called Cromer Attacking the Spirits of the Water. And I just love how Runciman isolates this figure, this mythical figure of Cromer, and he's reaching out to these spirits that are in the clouds. They're sort of hiding there, and people are rushing through, being blown by wind.
Super romantic.
It definitely is. So it reminds me a little bit, actually, of Henry Fuseli.
Yeah, that these sort of visionary artists who are imbuing everything with a kind of subjective emotion. We're getting a lot of feeling. It's not about delineation as much as it is about creating feeling in us. And again, this is the first Let's Talk Art, I think, where we've had two figures with swords or knives. Maybe not, but.
One of them, certainly, yes.
Yeah, there, see, he's got a blade.
Yep. Now, shifting gears to something very different, another strength of our collection that's been built up here is a photograph of our Reinhardt gallery that contains a great deal of art glass. From the Art Nouveau period, we also have some pieces that come up into the modern era, it's the 20th century.
We have some nice things also in the Fulton Gallery. So I'm so glad you included this photograph, because it is a wonderful little surprise when you're in the museum to walk into this room and see all of this beautiful luminous glass. And we have great examples of Tiffany and Lalique also in the other gallery. So it really is a strength of our collection.
And that part of the collection has been built through many gifts from a number of people, the Lewisons of Baltimore, Constance Kaplan, and very much so Michael and Ines Merson, who have been so generous for almost 30 years in donating.
And I love, if he listens, he moved from Baltimore to San Francisco, and he is still being good to the museum. So many thanks to the Mersons for all they've done to help us develop the art glass collection, and also our Maryland artists, which are an interest of theirs as well.
Yes. So on the left, back in 1999, the Mersons donated this one that's you can see on view in the Kirstein Gallery of the museum right now, this Lotz Phenomen vase, which is really beautiful. The coloring of it is just wonderful. It has this luminescence, and it is of the Art Nouveau period. And it makes a really nice pairing with this one here that's done by Edward Colonna for the famous Art Nouveau dealer Siegfried Bing. And it's called the Art Nouveau Bing vase.
First, one thing is, I can't imagine the vase on the left. I can't imagine ever putting anything in it. It seems like it would be distracting, right? Because it is such a beautiful object on its own. I often, people talk to me about, taste and connoisseurship and how to select things. And I usually say that my personal criteria is simply, I don't get tired of looking at it. If it's something that I can look at day in, day out, find new ways to appreciate it, then it's great, whether it's in a thrift shop or in a museum. And this vase certainly is absolutely fantastic. I could never get tired of looking at that. And the Siegfried Bing on the other side, I mean, that's fabulous too. It's like the quintessence of Art Nouveau in terms of that design.
Yes. And noted for these abstracted botanical motifs, whereby the flower petals and the actual stems and the green part of the plant sort of morph with and enclose and get very fanciful with the overall design.
It's a way of, I think if I were teaching art history, which I know you do sometimes, Daniel, this is a really great visual for connecting Art Nouveau to Rococo, which is something that they deliberately did in France because they wanted that dominance they had during the 18th century with the Rococo period, all the curvilinear forms and all the embellishment. And so Art Nouveau became a way of almost kind of modernizing that it really became, particularly in jewelry and decorative arts in France, a very dominating commercial form. And of course, Bing is the person who founds La Maison de l'Art Nouveau, the House of Art Nouveau. And he may even have coined the name. Do you know if that's the case, Daniel? I'm not sure.
I believe he did, yes. I think he may have been one of, or at least among the group that came up with that name. Yes, which opened in 1895.
Which I think, it's enduringly appealing. I mean, the exhibition we did that closed in January, Pan, the print exhibition, part of that story was the Art Nouveau story, and this way of integrating the arts into all aspects of life. And so many of these prominent Art Nouveau designers made wonderful homes for themselves and were involved in so many aspects of decoration. And I read that Colonna actually did Canadian rail cars. So wouldn't it be amazing to ride on a train with an interior designed by the fellow who did this vase?
It must have been something else. And actually, he also was involved with creating the designs and the interior decoration for Siegfried Bing's pavilion at the Paris World's Fair of 1900 for the reception area, the music room. And it was at that time that Colonna really attained the pinnacle of his career. So
Bing had to have had so much confidence in his own aesthetic judgment. I mean, he collaborated and partnered with so many artists. So he had windows at his shop that were designed by, I believe it was Fauve artists, but they were executed by Tiffany. He was just a master at kind of creating this artistic synergy and creating collaborations and support and making things happen. I've had a lot of fun the times in my career where we've been involved with Art Nouveau, and I've been able to sort of dive back into Bing because he really did sort of catalyze a lot.
Indeed, he was very influential. He also helped to introduce Japanese and other Asian art to a Western market, beginning in the 1880s and also into the 1890s. So he was a pivotal figure in the art world at that time. Also from the Mersons, but quite different in terms of the type of ceramic, we have here a piece, the bowl that you see on the right, from about 1950 to 72, done by Gertrude and Otto Natzler. And they were Jewish immigrants who escaped the Nazi rise to power in Europe. They fled Vienna for Los Angeles in September 1938, and they established their own studio and entire practice here in this country, with Gertrude working as the potter and her husband there, Otto, as the glazer. And they really
and the kiln master, I read it. So like the technical aspects of let's make sure what we pull out of the kiln isn't ruined, and let's get glazes that are beautiful and unique is him. And she revolutionizes wheel throwing. I read that. They're a great story, a wonderful story.
Yeah, they really are. The work that you see here on the right, I'll show a couple of examples in a moment. They epitomize harmony between form and glaze, and they also explored color, depth, and texture, as well as intricate pattern, but often in a more abstract manner. In that regard, in terms of the textures, quite different from what we were looking at before with the Art Nouveau pieces.
Sure. I mean, I think they were very interested in looking at earlier Asian ceramics and other kinds of ceramics and kind of making them new again. Just really beautiful colors here and a sense of touch to these, which is, I guess, kind of an abstract thing to say, but you can really kind of feel the hand here and the balance. I think they're just really beautiful. You could, they also look a little, they like these narrow bottoms, at least all the ones you're showing. So I wouldn't want them in my house with my cat.
Yes, and the one that we received, this one looks quite precarious. Yes. With that small base. Yes, there's a sort of very much an emphasis on earthiness in it. You're not hiding the material at all. It's not super polished. So it's in that regard quite modern.
At the same time, yeah, really, really harmonious, I think. This feeling to them of just being just right. Yeah.
This has also been a year in which we've been able to expand our holdings of contemporary art, or at least art from the last 20 to 30 years. And we were fortunate enough to be approached by the Kohler Foundation, which is in Wisconsin, and offered works by an artist named William S. Stutterer, who actually was born in Hagerstown, and his artistic training started at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. He took classes in our basement
I love this story, and I love the fact that, two of the pieces are very large, contemporary paintings. We don't have a lot of second half of the 20th century work of that scale on view, or of that time period at all. And people kind of stop at their tracks for them. And I love the fact that, he's a Hagerstown boy, and that we have these paintings. I think he's really interesting. He's cryptic. He's one description was he's an artist's artist. I think there's a lot of sort of personal mythology going on in these paintings, as well as loving the subtlety of this color and these brushstrokes. Of course, there's Daddy Diver on the left, who hangs very close to your office right now. In this photograph doesn't do the texture in that pink background justice. So he's using these complementary colors. It's really arresting visually, and really cryptic at the same time, and really big.
Yes, they're enormous. This one is in our collection. This one here called Mask, which is outside of the front administrative offices at the museum. But the one on the right I show as an example in terms of the series it came from. This one is not in the collection, and it's just called Grr. And it sort of has this, I guess you could say, scary undertone to it. You have this mask-like face, like the one we have, that emerges from this mist, and it's with this gritting teeth. And it's just staring not directly at us, but sort of past us in a void that almost looks like clouds or fog, at least to me.
But I think he's really like having fun with these very painterly backgrounds, and there's this sort of personal mythology, cryptic symbolism, but there's also clearly a real enjoyment of the materials and Mask. Now that you've switched slides, but the one that hangs outside our office, instead of continuing to think about why the mask, one day I started appreciating how it's layers, and how, that the mask is on top of another piece of fabric or some other thing on top of another thing. And the layering of it is what kind of has my attention now. I'll look at it again tomorrow and see how I feel.
Yeah, they really require looking. And, recently I was having a conversation with a colleague who studied Dutter's work quite a bit. And one of the things she pointed out to me is, and you can't get it in this photograph, the slide, is he sort of, with the big canvases like Daddy Diver, he sort of excavates the canvas. There's this thick impasto technique, and it's almost like he was working the medium.
Even that, the pink background, in person, it's heavily textured. You almost, we don't touch things in museums, but you could probably run your fingers through it almost like a maze if you were traveling, a maze in a like kids workbook or something. They're raised sides to those lines of paint, and they're within each other, and it's very, it's a very deliberate pattern of this pink and green, with a lot of texture.
And the one that we have as part of the series, this one is called Tango, that shows a mermaid embracing a diver with an old-fashioned diver suit. And so when you see this sort of in relationship, you can see he was literally probing the depths of the sea and creating his own personal mythology, which continued into 1987 with this painting called Mambo, that again shows the diver. And there's the bubbles being released from the top of the diving helmet. And he's holding up what looks like some kind of an eel.
It does. It's pretty scary.
Yeah. So once you see them in the book, more in context, it starts to become clear that this was kind of a series that he was gradually creating and exploring.
He's, I mean, we mentioned that he's a Hagerstown native. The artist quote, for whatever that's worth, who is an artist and who isn't. I'm not quite sure what that means, except that I think that he was very, very self-determined, and he was part of a social scene and a world of sort of art intelligentsia, but he seemed very happy to follow his own path. And he went to MICA, and we pride ourselves on the strengths in our collection that come from MICA. And I think in the future, we're probably going to be doing an exhibition just based on our collection of MICA alumni. So it's great to have his work because of that too.
Yes, and
decade after decade with very little public recognition.
yeah, and that's one of the things that we are trying to do at the museum, is to tell stories by artists who've not had their work and their creative expression brought to the forefront. And certainly for Dutter, he shied away from commercial galleries and everything that went with that. He did teach at the Corcoran School of Art in DC to pay his bills, but what he really loved was the research and being immersed in the artistic process during his lifetime.
I love that description. We're formal and funky at the same time. I can't read the bottom. Who said that?
Jack Rasmussen.
Jack. So, okay. Jack, I've never met him, but I have emailed him. That's great. Formal and funky at the same time. I'll go with that too.
Yes. Jack has collaborated with the museum on the exhibition devoted to Carol Brown Goldberg back in 2018. And he's at the Katzen Art Center at the American University.
That's a wonderful quote. Thank you, Jack, for that, because that's great.
Yes. And then we also, he became friends with Grace Hartigan, who you see the quote there. And she also remarked, Bill invented and interpreted life for himself and then shared it in his art. And then we have the one there talking about his dedication and his role as an artist. And then these are a collection of other ones. So very interesting.
A serious sense of humor. That's another great one. A serious sense of humor.
When he worked in DC, he also shared a studio with African-American abstract artist Sam Gilliam. And he became friends with Tom Downing, as well as Ann Truitt, Howard Marion, and Gene Davis, who were part of this circle of Washington abstract artists. And this is another one. Again, you could see his stylistic variety is quite remarkable.
It's
with this one,
and I think there's a wonderful sense of subtle color harmony. Sometimes maybe not as subtle, but really, really beautiful contrast going on in that, and a nice sense of touch. You guys can see Scout behind me.
From there, we shift gears again, showing the diversity of our acquisitions. We go back to the 18th century. One of our trustees, and also a donor named Eleanor Lakin, was kind enough to donate 2 prints. This one actually with quite a story. It's by Thomas Cook, who was one of the printmakers who really promoted the very famous English satirical artist and visual commentator on English society in the mid-1700s, William Hogarth. And Cook created this print after Hogarth's painting of the very controversial politician Simon Lord Lovat, otherwise known as Simon Fraser, who was known for feuding, changing of political allegiances, and getting himself really into a lot of trouble when in the 1740s, he supported the Jacobite rebellion, the uprising against the Hanoverian regime. He wanted to place Charles Edward Stuart on the throne with the Jacobites, but he was defeated at the Battle of Culloden, and he ends up being imprisoned, tried, convicted of treason, and then he's executed. And the print that we have here is done after the painting that shows St. Simon at St. Albans, so almost before he's executed in his older age. And he just sort of stares out at the viewer in this sort of way. He looks sort of tired.
See, the hand gesture makes me think that there's something he's trying to get across to us. If you, the positioning of the fingers is pretty unusual. Like, is he gonna say first, second? I just want to know what it is he's trying to communicate with us. It's pretty unusual, because it feels more, sometimes you'll see like a presentation kind of gesture in portraiture, but this really feels like conversation to me.
Yes, almost as if he's about ready to speak and list off to us his points, because you see he has his quill and paper ready there, like you see in the painting. And Hogarth, ever the social commentator, he sort of in a way caricatures him as well, which he was also very adept at doing. So the print is very interesting to see how it differs from the original oil painting in the National Portrait Gallery in London. Also from Eleanor is Jacob Torenfleet, a Dutch Golden Age printmaker, who actually, Sarah, was a contemporary of Gottfried Schalken, and part of those Dutch fine schilders or fine painters at the end of that period in the Netherlands. And this is a lovely portrait of a standing dog. I just love the way it looks up to the right there. It's standing proudly here in the landscape.
Yes, he's not, sometimes the Dutch artists put dogs in defecating and doing things to make a point in their paintings, but this dog is well behaved and beautiful, and very carefully and tenderly rendered for us.
And it makes a nice pairing with the artist's contemporary, a slightly earlier artist, but still contemporary, Karel Dujardin, of Two Sheep, another Dutch animal subject that was from the O'Briens. So we are building a small selection of animal portraits, which is very nice.
And people, the public loves them. We all love our animal friends, and the fact that these actually feel like portraits make them so much more special, because you feel like you're looking at an individual animal with a personality that you can connect to. It's nice.
They're beautiful. This year also brought some very interesting acquisitions from the estate of a donor to the museum named Alice Brumbaugh. And she collected a wide variety of things, including a print that you see here on the left that was part of that bequest by the famous French realist. And again, building on what we were talking about with Hogarth, as interested in satire, Daumier is the satirist par excellence.
I had down a note to talk to you about like what connections there were between Daumier and Hogarth. Daumier, I think, even more so, right? That it's social, maybe that's not right, more so, but a lot of social commentary, a lot of humor, somehow mixing realism and the observation of daily life with this really sharp wit.
Yes. The one that we're looking at that we were given was done for this illustrated periodical that was devoted to satire called Le Charivari, which takes its name from a French word for a loud, boisterous parade that was intended originally to shame or punish wrongdoers. So how appropriate here with Daumier's sort of scathing visual satires of particular individuals. In this case, poking fun at these people who will be distributing prizes. And this relates to other Charivari illustrations that we have in the collection, like A Difficult Navigation from the Les Canotiers Parisiens. We actually have quite a large selection in our holdings of Daumier lithographs.
You've told me that we probably could do a Daumier exhibition with the number of prints we have in the collection.
And that hasn't been done for many years. I think back probably when they arrived sometime around 1951 or 52. Daumier was, like Gustave Courbet, he was a self-professed communist, a leftist. He was a Republican Democrat. He attacked the bourgeoisie, the church, lawyers, judiciary, and also the monarchy.
Just about everybody was fair game.
Yes. So he really took aim at anybody in this instance.
We're in the second class wagon of the train here.
Exactly. And it's very humorous the way he's depicted these people. So, with big heads and little bodies, like political cartoons. Very different from Honoré Daumier, from Alice Brumbaugh's collection, a study for a mural decoration by Charles Hazelwood Shannon, who collaborated with the aesthetic movement painter and designer Charles Ricketts, who was associated with A.H. McMurdo and William Morris. So like Lathrop, Francis Lathrop, Shannon is connected to this group of artists around William Morris. So Shannon actually and Ricketts set up a small printing press, sort of emulating William Morris, who created beautiful handmade books. One of those examples was in the Pan exhibition, for any of you who were able to see it, with a beautiful work from Edward Burne-Jones.
She's lovely, though. This is there's so much, if you look at his work, which I did very briefly, it screams aesthetic movement, the paintings, this kind of soft fuzziness. It makes me think of Whistler. It makes me think of Wilmer doing these sort of very pretty kind of things, but she's just just incredibly naturalist figures, just really wonderful drawings.
That's stunning. Here's one just of a figure study from 1914 that was on the art market.
It's kind of like, we often talk about drawing as something people can understand better than painting, right? Painting, there's a lot of technique. And in fact, my son has been taking painting for 2 semesters now, and it's hard if you don't paint a lot. It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of understanding of materials. But most people, even if we're not accomplished draftsmen, we've occasionally made a sketch like, gee, I want the couch to go here, or, drawing is a tool we use in our lives. And so there's a directness to drawing, that you don't see in other media. And I think that's part of the appeal of how beautiful the drawings are, because we get it. We've all held a drawing tool and just look how lovely that is. Okay, that was a public service announcement.
Since it will come back to Kitta Kolditz in a minute, but since you're talking about drawing, sir, I think it makes sense to go to the Hans Theo Richter, which is so introspective and sensitive, of this little girl with a kerchief.
That's a lovely drawing too, and yeah, you're right, and it's a different, because I wouldn't necessarily say that it has the same kind of naturalism that we were just looking at. This feels more stylish. There's simplification happening. There's a kind of internal editing going on by the artist, but at the same time, I think that's intensifying the emotion for us.
Yes, she is sort of sitting there in contemplation. It's just so economic in terms of the lines and the negative space around her, but there's so much going on in there at the same time that's suggested.
Exactly. Beautiful.
Some very important acquisitions from the bequest also include prints by the famed Kitta Kolditz, one of the most important women artists of the 20th century, particularly in Germany, but even beyond that. And this shows a portrait of a working woman in a blue shawl. It's a color lithograph on paper, and you can see, look at the light on this woman's face. As Kollwitz was part of the German Expressionist movement, she sympathized very much with the working classes and sought to capture their condition.
She was always interested, I think, in visceral experience and real experience. There was the quote that I used during the Pan exhibition, because she was represented in that, about how when she went to France, she wanted to go to the basement bars where the fights were breaking out. She really wanted to know sort of like the maybe like the lowest common denominator of existence. She was really trying to pick up on that and express it for us. And of course, she's known as a really accomplished printmaker.
These works that you see in this slide are already in the collection that were generously donated over the last about 13 years, even before that, almost 20 years now. This early one of a self-portrait of the artist at a table, which is currently on view in the museum, right outside the front offices, administrative offices.
And of course, this makes me think, about other incredibly sensitive printmaker, Rembrandt. The light, this is very Baroque in the way it's lit, and it feels very Dutch in the interior. So it's kind of multi-layered. And the expression on her face is wonderful too.
And then another self-portrait from 1916 here, where her head emerges from the paper, I mean, literally from the space. And that relates to the one that was part of the bequest from 1924 here. So we go from 1916 to 24. And this is a crayon lithograph transfer on paper. And self-portrait in the profile towards the right, going up even later in her life, probably done sometime between 1938 and 45. So with this bequest, we've expanded the holdings that we have of Gitta Kollwitz's portraits, particularly self-portraits. So we're able to sort of tell the story through a good part of her career through these prints. Another work that's in the collection that was in our Women Artists exhibition in 2020. This is very powerful. It's from the Peasants' Revolt series. It's called Outbreak. And it's really a powerful image.
I love how her the media emphasizes the meaning, right? How well she uses the format that she's chosen to use. It's just so so powerful.
Yes, it's as if these figures are sort of combining together into sort of one body, if you will, or force, and moving off towards the left as this woman rallies their energy, their actions. The bequest also includes important examples of WPA artists like Alice Geneva or Jean Kloss, who spent a great deal of time in New Mexico with the Taos Artists Group. And she was actually among the only etchers of the WPA artists, because many of them worked in lithography, but Jean Kloss really worked predominantly with the dry point and aquatint technique to create prints like you see on the left of eve of the green corn ceremony, Santo Domingo Pueblo. The light in this one is just stunning. Beautiful. So one artist who has a very interesting story, who's part of the bequest, and then we may have time for a few Japanese prints, created this yellow pear portrait of the fruit, little still life. But he's perhaps most famous, Robert Kulicka, for the frames that he created in the style of original period frames. That is, he created reproductions, most famously for the Epiphany in the Metropolitan by Giotto, and then Leonardo da Vinci's Ginevra da Vinci in the National Gallery in DC. So the same artist, his primary occupation was frame making, but he was a painter as well. So he was commissioned by the two museums to create these.
It's so interesting because the still life is a kind of trompe l'oeil thing. You know, you want to grab the pear out of the painting, and it's not dissimilar in approach to the idea that he's trying to make you know, frames that look like Renaissance frames. So creating this virtual reality kind of thing. Daniel and I were looking at this earlier, and there are these little holes. We're wondering if he made his own frame for his own piece. And, you know, there are little holes there. So is that faux boring of insects, or is it old wood that actually has insect bore holes in it? I'll have to have somebody look at it and see.
Yes, I'm going to guess, Sarah, that he probably made it himself, considering how many of these frames he made. So, but we'll have to look into it more. Some other notable acquisitions. I'll leave also some time for any questions there might be that came in very recently, just this month. Remarkable walrus or whalebone carving from Northwest Russia, specifically Kolmogorye, of Grand Duke Pavel Petrovich, who later became Tsar Paul of Russia.
Okay, so the strangest thing about this for me, I mean, it's intricate, it's amazing, it's the carving, but that motif of the sort of chest plate with the portrait on it or whatever it is. So he's kind of like, it makes me think of Voldemort having the the other head on the back of his head. Yeah, it's really odd, and maybe you know more about that and can explain it to us.
Yeah, if any of you are familiar with you know, some of the motifs of classical mythology or Renaissance and Baroque painting, you will often see that Medusa has a shield that has a gorgon on it. Sorry, I should say Athena has a shield with a head of Medusa or a gorgon that's embossed on her shield. And this was something that she had acquired. I think it may have been from Perseus in mythology.
Because Medusa's killed by her own reflection, right? So perhaps it's somehow connected to that.
So what happens with some of these royals is they will adopt these motifs from classical antiquity. And here what you have is you kind of have this heroic type of head that he's wearing sort of as a decorative chest plate that shows his military strength or power, like that of Minerva or Athena from classical antiquity. So it's sort of hearkening back to a type of decoration you would have seen on Roman imperial military garb and accessories. So that's my sort of interpretation of it. Symbol of strength, political power, but it's really beautifully carved.
Extra face. He's got an extra face.
He does. Perhaps his alter ego. Let's see. These are also quite interesting. Artist Aaron Kameny, whose son Fred Kameny donated these two really interesting collages to the museum. And Sarah and I were talking about these. It's sort of like the early 20th century synthetic cubism meets pop art from later in the century.
It's true. But also, you know, just obviously a very nice sense of design and composition. He's an interesting artist because he was a social realist earlier in his career. So, you know, I often tell people, we know most people know a fraction of what's happening in the art world. You know, there are only a handful of artists who most people can name by name, But there are artists all around us who are eking out a living in various ways. So it's really interesting sometimes to look at the trajectory of careers when people need to support themselves and they're trying to stay current. And I won't even say with fashion, they want to stay intellectually current. They want to stay engaged with the ideas of the times. So it's really interesting to look at his career in that way.
Yes, and as Sarah mentioned, originally Fred comedy was a social realist, and here he is in front of a very visceral painting of lynching from the cover of Time magazine back in, I believe it was the 30s or 40s. And it's really interesting and to see how different this painting, this work was compared to what he moves into by the 1960s with these collages that respond to pop art.
Well, we have had people here an hour or a few minutes more. So I think there were a couple more things we might want to click through really fast. We have some Japanese prints, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat while Daniel is showing some of these Japanese prints that have joined our collection.
Yes, a donor named Ingrid Omdahl donated a group of Japanese prints, ukiyo-e prints, from the 19th century and the 20th centuries. So we have added some of these to the collection. They're beautiful. They're by Hiroshige, who of course is very famous. And one of these is one of the scenes from the 53 stations of the Tokaido from about 1833 to 36. And here's station 15 and number 46. These are beautiful snow scenes. This one here, and then the one on the right, the driving rain at Shono. Just beautiful. Look at the way that the water comes down across the surface of this. Just beautiful. Of course, Hiroshige and Hokusai, they really revolutionized printmaking in Japan. There's such a painterly quality to these prints.
And of course, had a huge impact on European art in the 19th century, as well as more exposure to the, composition and color of Japanese prints really impacted artists everywhere.
We also have some series from the prints from the series 100 Views of Edo, like this one on the left, and then this one that's in our collection already. And then works that are from the series Lady Murasaki's Genji cards, related to the tale of Genji, one of the most important novels of certainly in the East Asian tradition and perhaps the world, sometimes considered by people to be among the first of its kind. These are just beautiful. This is already in the collection. And then some gorgeous Hokusai prints of birds and flowers in Hiroshige.
I love, I'm coming up on my 3-year anniversary at the museum, and it's been really fun because while we are not by any means an encyclopedic museum, we are certainly an eclectic museum, and we have a marvelously rich collection with a huge diversity of material, and it just makes it so much fun to care for, grow, work with. We never have a boring work day, do we, Daniel?
No, we do not. Makes our job really very interesting. And I love working with works of art from all different cultures. At the museum, we're not restricted in terms of only being able to collect one type of work or culture.
Do we have any questions from anybody who is out there? Or comments or things you would like Daniel to go back and put on the screen again because you just thought it was so marvelous? Got a quiet group tonight. I will go ahead then and do my wrap up here. So Our next Let's Talk Art is, I believe, June 29th. Is that right, Daniel? Did we get a question? Thought I heard you starting to talk. Sorry. I think it's June 29th, our next Let's Talk Art, and that's going to be really fun because we have with us a friend and colleague of mine from Pittsburgh named Heather Semple, who is an art expert, but also happens to be related to William Henry Singer, which of course I didn't know for the many years that I was in Pittsburgh, but she is going to join us to talk about sort of the family legacy. And that will be in relation to Landscapes and Legends of Norway, William Henry Singer and his contemporaries. So that should be a really fun and special evening. If you enjoy streaming art related videos, you can go to our YouTube channel and find a lot of things. Every one of our Let's Talk Arts lives on our YouTube channel, and we have a healthy library of other digital offerings there as well. So I will just say thank you to everybody for being with us, and thank you for being a part of the museum, and hope to see you at the museum. Oh, one last commercial, May 10th, I'm doing Art Social Hour, and it's going to be Gottfried Schalken. And I think I might have mentioned this at the beginning, but in March we had technical difficulties. So I'm using the same topic again. So if you're a museum member, contact Donna and get the link, D. Rastelli at wcmfa.org. You probably know how to find her. And we'll have a nice talk about that marvelous painting in the collection, which I love even more now that I've spent more time with it. So good night, everyone. Thank you so much, Daniel. Daniel does most of the work for this. So I always appreciate that he puts together a nice PowerPoint that gives me opportunity to talk with him and with all of you as well. So good night.
Thank you, sir.